Welcome everyone to our talk today on the role of faith in the US election. My insights from from my time in the Obama administration. We are very fortunate to have Michael Ware who'll be speaking to us. But before we start our main talk, please can we have a recitation of Quran?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا. بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما. قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. Today, we're very fortunate to have Michael Ware, who will be speaking to us about the role of faith in the US election, his insights from his time in the Obama administration. Michael is a leading strategist, speaker, and practitioner at the intersection of faith, politics, and public life. He's advised the President Obama, as well as a number of the nation's leading foundations, nonprofits, and public leaders on some of the thorniest issues and exciting opportunities that define American life today. He's argued that the spiritual health and civic character of individuals is deeply tied to the state of our politics and public affairs. As one of President Obama's ambassadors to America's believers, Michael directed faith outreach for President for President Obama's historic 2012 re-election campaign. He was also one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served in the White House Faith-Based Initiative during Obama's first term, where he led evangelical outreach and helped manage the White House engagement on religious and values issues, including adoption, anti-human trafficking efforts. He's previously served as chief strategist and member of the exec team for the AND campaign, and is the co-author of Compassion and Conviction, the AND campaign's guide to faithful civic engagement, alongside Justin Giboney and Christopher Butler. It's a real pleasure to have him. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael to speak. And thank you all on YouTube who are watching, and those who are joining here on Zoom. If you do have any questions, please do write them on the YouTube channel in the chat, or and look forward to hearing from everyone else soon. Michael.
It is just such an honor to be with you. Consider it an honor to be hosted by you, and looking forward to the time we have together today. I don't plan to give a sort of keynote lecture so much as sort of put some facts and some ideas on the table about the recent presidential election that America just went through, and then look forward to questions that you might have about that. What I'll do first is just sort of give a very quick primer on religious demographics in the United States. Then talk about a bit about how American religious communities view politics. Review, again, briefly, how religion played out in the 2016 election, and really just pull out a few, I think, key facts that affected what happened in 2020. And then finally talk about what just happened earlier this month in 2020. And so where I'll start is just to give you a bit of context for America. There have been a lot of stories recently about sort of a rise of secularism or a rise of religious disaffiliation in the United States, and that is true. We've seen a pretty significant rise, particularly over the last couple of decades, in religious disaffiliation. That narrative should not be should not lead one to suggest that America is anything but a profoundly religious country, demographically speaking, even today. So religious disaffiliation and religious unaffiliation has risen to now. Estimates are about a quarter of the population, about 26% of Americans do not affiliate with a specific religious tradition. Obviously, that still means about 3/4 do. Vast majority of Americans say they believe in God. Majority of Americans belong to a Christian tradition. And then there are significant numbers in America minority faiths. So about 2% of Americans are Jewish, about 1% Muslim, 1% Hindu, 1% Buddhist. Just to break down the Christian demographics a bit, when we're talking about in terms of the population, Catholics make up about 20%, and that's all Catholics. Non-evangelical white Protestants make up about 12% of the American population, and white evangelicals make up about 16% of the American population. And so when you're looking at America as a whole, now this isn't voters, this is the American population, is basically what you see. One just interesting note, and we'll get to this a bit later on, when it comes to Muslims in America, they trend younger than most religious populations in the United States. And then just important for when we're talking about elections, there are high concentrations of Muslim voters in states like Michigan, Minnesota, Virginia, Florida, states that have particular import in American presidential elections. And so that's important to keep in mind. Just a couple of notes I want to offer on how American religious communities think about politics. And that's just to say that there are significant differences in how various religious communities view politics. There is not a direct correlation in America between the rate of religious observance and political party. The level of religiosity does not map directly onto political preference. That being said, there are religious communities that internally align significantly with one political party over another. The Jewish community in America tends to vote Democratic in presidential elections. The Muslim community, especially as of late, tends to vote Democratic in presidential elections. If you put a racial lens over the religious lens, Black Protestants tend to vote Democratic. White evangelicals tend to, in almost a mirror image, white evangelicals vote for Republicans. And then there are communities like Catholics, taken as a whole, where it's much more even. So Catholics are often considered by political scientists and those who watch elections as a bellwether constituency because they are more closely split along party lines than other communities. The other just note I'd make here is that there's significant and increasing scholarly debate about whether there's clarity around the idea that politics is driving faith more than faith is driving politics. Increasingly, scholars are putting forward evidence that suggests that as polarization, as sort of political identity looms larger in Americans' conscience and in the American conscience and in our political life, that polarization can actually be driving religious identity and political views more than faith. As a person of faith, I would hope to see it the other way around, that people's faith was informing their views on politics and much else. There's increasing evidence that actually, for instance, identification as evangelical, for instance, might be driven by Republican Party identification as opposed to evangelical beliefs leading one to be Republican. And so that's an interesting sort of debate and factor to think about when we talk about specific election results. The election in 2016, I think, has significant indications for what happened in 2020, obviously, because Donald Trump was on the ballot in both elections. But what I want to pull out from this discussion is just how central faith was to Donald Trump's victory in 2016, which may seem counterintuitive. Donald Trump is someone who's been in public life for decades, and religion didn't really play a significant role in his public profile up until he started running for president. Obviously, religion has played a significant role in American politics, and it's more like politics sort of, in order to enter politics, sort of religion became important to Trump as opposed to Trump bringing a religious import into politics. Nonetheless, it played a significant role in 2016. I've argued that Trump's very direct, bold appeals to people of faith, specifically Christians, specifically white Christians, played a significant role in the election. We saw significant turnout among white evangelicals. We saw him win a higher rate among white evangelicals than Mitt Romney or John McCain, the two previous Republican nominees. The other aspect of 2016 is, as I've argued in the past, is that the Democratic nominee in 2016 did not significantly contest Donald Trump's appeals to religious communities, to particularly broad swaths of American religious communities, particularly those that might be associated with the right of the political spectrum or the center of America's political spectrum. And because that was uncontested, it affirmed Donald Trump's sort of bold claims that he was the only one who would defend the role of Christianity and the role of religion in this country, that Donald Trump was the only one who would sort of stand up against sort of anti-religious forces. So in 2016, Donald Trump won Catholics. Again, he won the white evangelical vote significantly. He won by a pretty significant margin white mainline Protestants. Actually, in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost, who was the Democratic nominee, lost among all but a few religious categories compared to Barack Obama's numbers in 2012. So I believe, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe Hillary Clinton picked up maybe a point or two among Jewish voters. I believe she picked up a point or two among LDS voters. And I believe she may have picked up a point or two among the religiously unaffiliated. Outside of that, she saw drops basically in every category, which again contributed to her loss. In 2020, there are just a few elements of the campaign I want to pull out. The first is that even dating back to the Democratic primary, Joe Biden seemed intent from the start on ensuring that Trump was contested on the grounds of faith. Joe Biden announced his campaign from the beginning with a moral message, one that for many voters hearkened directly and explicitly back to the mantra of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King founded. Their mantra was about redeeming the soul of the nation. And of course, Joe Biden spoke so consistently about restoring the soul of America. This was reflected, Biden's commitment to faith was reflected not just in sort of that opening speech, but in his advertising. So you would see both explicit ads targeted to faith communities, but what you'd also see is faith, whether it would be everyday people of faith that were identified through their religious dress or through the fact that they were walking out of a church, or that kind of featured in general ads that went out to the whole country. But you'd also see, for instance, the Biden campaign put out an ad about COVID, about the pandemic. And it was a 30-second ad. It was in the closing, maybe 6-8 weeks of the campaign. And this ad, this had it wasn't a religious ad. It wasn't targeted to religious groups, but in a series of, frames, one frame of the ad was of a clergy, a person in a hospital consoling a family. This is a window into the way the Biden campaign approached faith, which was not just sort of quote religious leaders, which Biden did, was not just to have staff that were doing religious outreach, though they did that too, but they also sent a broader message to the general public that they saw the role that religion played in American life and welcomed it and had a positive view of the role faith played in the lives of millions of Americans and in virtually every American community. This, in my view, was critical. It was critical on its own merits, critical if you're running for president of the United States to communicate that you see Americans as they are. It was also critical in heading off in a way that I believe that the 2016 Democratic nominee failed to do, heading off Donald Trump's argument that, again, that he was the only person who saw people of faith in America, that he was the only one that without him, and this was Trump's case, that without him, dark days were ahead for people of faith in America. It was so important that the Biden campaign consistently, strategically, carefully contested that claim, sometimes directly, but again, mostly just through their own sort of their own decisions internally, separate from Trump and what they communicated externally, of course. As for Donald Trump, he had the advantages of incumbency, which include a longer sort of runway to make a general election appeal. It includes the ability to use the incredible convening power of the White House, the powers of the presidency, to reach out to religious leaders and groups and implement policies that affect religious groups. And like in 2016, Donald Trump needed religion to work for him in a maximalizing kind of way in 2020 in order to win, given all of the headwinds he was facing, not just with the pandemic, but the fact that his approval ratings were pretty consistently under 50%, which meant that more than half of the country was not happy with the job he was doing, which is typically a sign that you're going to have trouble with your reelection. And so he was pretty focused on reaching religious voters. He did a few interesting things. One, there were religious leaders that Trump would lift up and provide access to that even previous Republican administrations would not have given that kind of platform for. And Trump identified that even if these religious leaders and traditions did not sort of approach respectability in terms of sort of the perspective of elites, that they represented a lot of people. And so this was a part of his 2016 run, but over his presidency, he capitalized on this. The other thing he capitalized on was he would, I think, in a political sense, quite wisely, appeal to religious leaders that had, and sort of slices of the religious community, they had very little oversight. So he was not reaching out to, politically speaking, his outreach was not focused on heads of nonprofits that had boards to report to, or even so much pastors that had, elders or had some kind of structure to hold them accountable and that kind of constricted their maneuvers. He was focusing on Christian music artists. He was focusing on televangelists that had their own platform and their own sources of wealth and sort of flexibility. And this was something of an evolution in Republican outreach, to have that kind of legitimacy granting and access, not from affiliated political arms, but from the candidate and the president himself, was significant. There's more I could say on the various campaign dynamics and what the campaigns did, but I'll leave that to the Q&A if there are other questions on that. I'll just wrap up by, what actually happened in 2020. So again, Biden seemed intent from the start on ensuring Trump was contested on faith, and that outreach was significant, and I think it bore fruit. And so we saw, compared to 2016, and I should note here, there are a number of different sources of numbers that you could pull from. I use the Edison exit poll data because it's the only data that's fully available now for which we have an apples to apples comparison in 2016. And so I am comparing 2020 exit polls with 2016 exit polls. And what we see is, in general, a return basically to 2012 numbers. So when Barack Obama and Joe Biden ran in 2012, we're seeing basically a return to those numbers when we're talking about religious splits. And so in 2016, white evangelicals accounted for 27% of the electorate. Donald Trump won them by 80 to 16%, with Hillary Clinton getting 16%. In 2020, white evangelicals still accounted for 27% of the electorate. And again, I would note to the opening of my presentation, remember, white evangelicals are only 16% of the American population, and yet they are overrepresented in terms of the electorate. Now, from a social science perspective, there are different sort of definitions that are invoked, and we could sort of dig into those numbers a bit more. What's clear is that white evangelicals are overrepresented in terms of the electorate as compared to just their percentage of the population as a whole. So in 2016, Donald Trump won white evangelicals, again, over a quarter of the electorate by 80 to 16. Joe Biden, according to the latest exit poll data, pulled 24%. So 150% increase nationally. And Donald Trump only got 76%. That's a significant swing of votes that accounts for about a 5 million vote swing nationally. We also saw Joe Biden win among Catholics, taking back the Catholic vote from Donald Trump, which Donald Trump won in 2016. We saw Joe Biden significantly improve the margins from 2016 among white Catholics. You may have seen in the news sort of reports that Trump gained among African American and Hispanic voters nationally. That is true. Generally, what we see is not Joe Biden losing among African American and Hispanic voters, but Trump's numbers going up. Generally, that's what we're seeing. But those were significant, and there are reasons for that. And we could talk about that. As far as other religious communities, we expect further religious data to come out. But unfortunately, we don't have as much fine-grained data as I'd want to see, unpacking, for instance, how Hispanic evangelicals voted or how American Muslims voted. That information is just not available. On the national level, we do see about 2/3 of American Muslims supporting Biden. Some reports show Trump gaining 3 to 4 points among American Muslims over his numbers in 2016. And again, happy to talk about that. But of course, the outcome of the election was Joe Biden winning back the Rust Belt, which is how Trump won in 2016. And faith was a major reason why he was able to do that. Just one final word on sort of moving forward, which is just to say that Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden, has the opportunity to renew an American commitment to pluralism, but will face intense headwinds. We have been through a period in this country that divisions have been exacerbated as opposed to being healed or reconciled. And that sort of stirring of conflict builds up a sense of distrust that won't simply be alleviated by a change in the presidency. And so both politically speaking, but also when we talk about deeper things like social cohesion and respect for religious minorities, when we talk about political polarization and the ability to reach political agreement and compromise, it's really one of the leading challenges that President-elect Joe Biden is going to face once he comes into office. He has signaled that he identifies that as a challenge and that it will be a chief priority of his administration. I've noted he closed his campaign making a case that, as he would say, that he was going to be a president for all Americans, not just Democrats, not just one slice of America. That rhetoric hasn't stopped as we've moved in the transition. If anything, he's doubled down on the mandate he sees to pursue greater national unity. And that's where I expect much of the energy to be focused, and where a lot of sort of the political determination of the future of our country, a lot of it will fall on whether he's successful or not. And so with that, I'll end my sort of formal remarks and sort of the comments I wanted to place on the table, but really looking forward to your questions and what conversations you might want to have in our remaining time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We've had quite a lot of questions, so let's start with the first one from someone from YouTube. Can you tell us a little bit more about evangelical Christianity, like a little bit about what it is and what makes it so appealing to white Americans?
So it's a big question, and part of why such a big, complicated question is because first, it's just so large. Again, we're talking about over a quarter of the American electorate. We're talking about 16% of the population. And evangelicalism includes literally 100 denominations. So it includes the Southern Baptist Convention, it includes the Wesleyans, it includes Assembly of God, it includes Pentecostals, and it includes high church evangelical Anglicans. And so it's a very broad umbrella. And then one of the other things I mentioned is the way that evangelicalism has become conflated with Republican politics in some sectors means that it is not just a religious movement, but that it has taken on political connotations as well. And so, just to give sort of evangelicals traditionally, the term comes from evangel, so to spread the good news. They traditionally have a high view of Scripture. They traditionally view the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament as inerrant, as inspired by God. The high view of the Bible is very important, again, traditionally to evangelicals. Evangelicalism is usually associated with the South in America. And typically, if you look at the electorate, you'll see, for instance, in Georgia, white evangelicals accounted for, I believe, 32% of the electorate. In a state like New Hampshire, they'll account for maybe 10% of the electorate, probably less. In the Rust Belt, which again was really important for Biden, white evangelicals tend to account for about 20% of the electorate, depending on the state. And so, I mean, there's much to say there. But that's a bit of an overview of evangelicalism. Again, it's just very hard to speak about it in one concise way, other than some broad theological principles that they tend to hold to, or at least traditionally are supposed to hold to, but it's now such a diffuse movement that has been both influenced by the culture and influencing culture, that evangelicalism is many things now. Electorally speaking, what we know is evangelicalism is, especially white evangelicalism, is overwhelmingly Republican. Although, again, I would note overwhelmingly Republican, with 80% voting for Republican as opposed to 76 voting for Republican, and 16% voting Democratic and 24% voting Democratic. That's millions of votes, again, because it's so large. So we pay attention to swings there in a more specific way than we would other smaller communities, because those percentage point swings amount for so many votes. The last note I'd say here is that there's significant difference when you look at evangelicals from different or come from different racial backgrounds. And so Black evangelicals tend to vote Democratic. Hispanic evangelicals tend to be one of those swing constituencies where they tend to vote a bit more for Republicans on the presidential level, but it's much closer than among white evangelicals. And so race plays into this a great deal and influences the way evangelicals of different races view politics in a way that's really important. And then just one note that I forgot to say explicitly when we're talking about evangelicals is that in terms of the political organizing around evangelicals, it has tended to revolve around just a few social issues, namely religious freedom, marriage and LGBT issues, and abortion. There have been efforts, and there are evangelicals who prioritize other issues when they vote, or prioritize issues alongside issues like abortion when they vote, like immigration, like climate change, because they believe that their faith calls them to be good stewards of the environment. Issues like poverty, but in American politics, certainly from the level of perception, if not from reality, the focus has been on just a handful of social issues since the 80s.
Thank you, Michael. Let me join a couple of questions together. So, which are quite related. So, one of the questions, as you can imagine, it's very hard for us to understand how Americans believe all of Trump's obvious lies. Could you shed some light on it? But linked to that, do you think there's an element of sophistication about some of the voters from a faith background, in that some of them may overlook actual character flaws, which perhaps would be seen as irreligious, with a view to broader policy issues which they are more attuned to? Is that what you see?
Yes, I think that's obviously part of what happens. And part of that comes from a general sort of cynicism about politicians generally that flattens out gradations of trustworthiness or experience or qualifications. And so if you're someone who generally is suspicious about politicians, thinks politicians are in it for themselves generally, someone who thinks that politicians lie generally, then you're more likely to approach Trump as with a perspective that maybe he's worse comparatively, but I never trusted any of them in the first place, or that's just what politicians do. I'd also say I wouldn't underestimate the value of Trump's sort of along that same line, the value of Trump's introduction to the American public being from outside of politics. So this is someone who, during the 80s and the 90s, was sort of a icon of business savvy and wealth. Now, whether that was justified or not, that was how he was sort of introduced to much of the country. And then in the 2000s, he had a reality TV show that was the highest rated in the country, in which he was portrayed as assertive, as someone who made decisions, as someone who could mentor other business leaders, someone who was economically savvy. And so he was able to import all of those those hours and hours, those decades and decades of presentation, of cultivation, of perception for millions of Americans. And he was able to import that like non-politicized perception into politics, which is generally pretty rare. I mean, so, we've had senators who have been, well, so it's rare in the unique power in which it had for him. Previous precedents I think about are, politicians that had been successful business people, or politicians who had been astronauts before, and then they're able to bring this sort of aura of expertise, this aura of being from outside of politics into politics, which is really which was useful to Trump. Just one last comment on this idea that voters sort of discredited character is a statistical fact, particularly among white evangelicals, where Public Religion Research Institute showed that prior to 2016, when Trump was first elected, white evangelicals were among the highest religious groups that would say that character mattered when it came to electing electing officials. After Trump was the Republican nominee, and during the campaign, white evangelicals actually dropped significantly on that issue, saying that character and ethics were much less important when considering political officials. Part of what this shows is, again, as I commented in my opening remarks, just the profound power of political tribalism and polarization in this country that religious groups are, at the very least, not exempt from. I hope that is helpful.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. Can we ask Afifa to speak to ask her question, please?
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that Biden's campaign kind of leveraged a lot of religious rhetoric this time around, and was a lot more kind of faith-friendly. Were there specific talking points in terms of policies that they used to reach out to religious groups, or was it just kind of this kind of rhetoric?
Yeah, so if you went to the Biden campaign website, you would see that they had specific policy plans relating to Catholics, relating to the Muslim community, related to the Jewish community. So that was significant. That was something that wasn't as forward in 2016. I think they also, at the staff level, had really robust communications to specific religious communities, where they were able to frame and communicate their platform commitments in ways that were sensitive to and tailored to specific religious communities. But I would say that the policy area was when I think about religious outreach, I think about it basically in from the presidential campaign level. I think about it principally in three ways. One is in sort of rhetoric. The other is sort of campaign infrastructure. And then the other is policy. On rhetoric and infrastructure, the Biden campaign did pretty well, especially on the rhetoric front, and which again rhetoric isn't meaningless. I think there's a lot of cynicism about political rhetoric, and rhetoric certainly isn't a replacement for a follow through or for concrete policy, but the kinds of messages our political leaders send has policy implications. But then that third area of policy is the area out of the three that Biden was not forced to develop and specify as much as he would have had he had, in my opinion, frankly, just a more competent opponent. And so because Donald Trump was not a standard politician who was going to articulate a policy case, who was going to, for instance, in the debates, really press Biden on specific policy points. And because his case to religious voters, Trump's case to religious voters, was much more emotional and with few exceptions, such as judges, much less sort of about feeling, Biden wasn't forced to necessarily reciprocate in that way. But there were some concrete policy commitments. So, for instance, Biden's policy plan calls for a bump up and allocation of funds to protect houses of worship from vandalism or attacks. So, for instance, for many Muslim communities, Jewish communities, and other religious minority communities in America, the idea that the Department of Homeland Security would help your congregation protect what would provide funds so that basic security measures could be put in place in your congregation. That was an act of and a show of attentiveness to the challenges that some communities face specifically. And then there were just policy offerings that weren't religion specific, but were attractive to, for instance, Hispanic congregations, majority Hispanic congregations, or majority or rural congregations. But in America, because of sort of the way policy works, and there are some good reasons for that, there isn't like a whole slate of religious specific, policy outreach. It's more about framing those policies in a way that connects with the values of various religious communities. I hope that helps.
Great. There are lots of questions coming in. Okay. How do you think Biden's politics in relation to Muslims in particular might differ from Obama's, both in terms of national and international policies?
Well, it's a good question. I think generally we're going to see significant continuation from the Obama presidency to the Biden presidency. I will say, I just think that Biden understands the work that is needed following a Trump presidency to not just return to normal or sort of return to pre-Trump years, but after a presidency in which you saw Donald Trump target specific Muslim communities, such as the Somali Muslim community in Minneapolis, for sort of suspicion that sort of just in a message of inclusion is not going to be enough, and that direct engagement is going to be necessary. And so I would expect in the first year for on a number of fronts, not just concerning Muslim communities, but certainly including them, for a more forthright reset of what Biden will advance as American values to take place, just because, again, we have been through 4 years in which those values have been very much contested by the Trump presidency. I think I'm not a foreign policy expert. I have some ideas there about how Biden will differ, but I don't want to sort of overextend, my expertise. What I would say is, Joe Biden is someone who I think brings a range of relationships and the history that Barack Obama did not have when he came into office as president. And I think that's going to significantly sort of affect, especially in the first year or two of Biden's presidency, the range of options on the table for Biden when it comes to American international leadership.
Great. Ali Kimji, his question.
Hi, Michael. So at the 2016 Democratic Convention, Kiza Khan was a keynote speaker in response to Trump's Muslim ban. But at the 2020 convention, there weren't any sort of key Muslim speakers. And that's despite Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar becoming more prominent over the last few years. Could you shed any light on that? And also the second part of the question is, it's often suggested that Republicans became pro-life on abortion to sort of attract evangelical voters. How true do you think that is?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first, which is, what's interesting is that evangelicals were actually the late comers to the abortion issue in the American context. It was Catholics who were pro-life. Evangelicals tended to not be too invested in the issue. It was certainly a part of their coming on board post Jimmy Carter, but that's just it's an interesting sort of fact of history that abortion was as much about what we would call sort of Reagan Democrats, which were primarily like the white working class Democrats who switched to vote for Reagan, as it was for consolidating evangelicals. And so that it's an interesting history there. The simple answer is yes, it was a critical piece. There were other sort of pieces at play as well there. And there are all kinds of alternative histories where, if Jimmy Carter had lost in 76, how would that have changed how this issue would have played out? Because you look at leading Democrats, including Joe Biden, but also people like Kennedy, there was a significant pro-life contingent within the Democratic Party at the time. So it wasn't inevitable that Republicans would be the pro-life party. To your first question, Khan wasn't asked to speak at the Democratic convention, obviously, solely because, or even I'd say primarily because he was because he's Muslim, but because of sort of a range of factors: the military profile, the fact that he had gained in such significant prominence, and because it sent a sort of broader message about sort of who Trump was in the context of that in the context of that convention. I wouldn't, and so because of that, I wouldn't look at. I don't think anyone at the 2020 convention was thinking through the lens of what religious groups were represented in sort of keynote speakers, though I would note there were Muslim clergy who gave who were involved in invocations and benedictions for the convention, which take place every night. But I just want to say that there was a significant sort of message being sent in terms of sort of religion, with not having Khan back to speak or anything like that. So yeah, that would be my thought.
Right, and another question that's come in, do you think there's any truth to the idea that some evangelicals who didn't actually like Trump or want him lent their vote to him because of the importance of the Supreme Court openings or likely openings?
Yes, I think that's certainly the case on sort of an anecdotal level. I will say what we saw when you look at overall when you look at the macro level, Republicans tended to approve of Donald Trump. He was not suffering from low approval ratings from Republican Party, and he, though there was some variation among white evangelicals, there wasn't the overwhelming number of white evangelical supporters of Trump were not expressing their views as conflicted as I and others might hope that they would be. Certainly there were those voters. I think obviously we saw, again, a swing of 5 million white evangelical voters from the Republican ticket in 2016 to the Democratic ticket in 2020. So I don't want to discredit that at the anecdotal level. But when you look at it from the macro level, there was not a seismic sort of tidal wave of white evangelical voters for whom, Trump had insulted or offended to such a degree that it created this huge vice for folks. That was certainly happening at a certain level among a certain number of voters, but it wasn't the predominant. It wasn't the predominant characteristic of evangelical Trump voters that they felt conflicted about their vote. Most white evangelicals voted for Trump happily. Now, one reason for that is that evangelical politics, as we discussed earlier, has been so narrow. And so if you're someone who thinks that, really the primary way in which your faith has political implications is on just a handful of social issues, then you won't feel conflict, even if, for instance, you'd say, I'd really like more to be done for the poor, or I oppose the child separation policy. If your tradition and the culture of your religious tradition is to suggest that really your vote should be influenced, primarily by these 2 or 3 social issues, then you're not going to be feeling a whole lot of tension.
Building on that question, do you believe that given 80% or approximately 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, did his racist rhetoric and anti-Muslim rhetoric not matter at all to them, in your view? Or do you think that it mattered to them, but they thought it was less important than other issues? And how do you think, is that part of it? So this is my additional bit. Do you think that there's an element here where religious leadership on issues to do with racism or anti-Muslim hate or Islamophobia, is that not important at all to leaders in religious communities?
Yeah. Well, so I'm afraid to say I think there was a portion who heard the rhetoric and liked it, and that's just an unfortunate fact that I and others are working on. So just for a bit of background, I released a report earlier this year in conjunction with the Democracy Fund on Christianity and pluralism and public life in the United States, which spends a significant amount of time talking about religious pluralism in particular, and religious pluralism in the context of sharing a country and communities of Muslim and Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist and other faiths. And so this is a big concern of mine. So I don't want to overstate the level of Trump support that was attracted to some of these comments. On the other hand, I don't want to pretend it was non-existent. And then I think, there's it's really important not to overestimate the percentage of Americans that are following what the president says on a day-to-day basis, who are following all the controversies that come up. Significant numbers of Americans, it's actually the minority that will have heard about some of these comments that you're alluding to. A minority of Americans who will even know that, Trump went to Minneapolis and said the things he did about the Muslim community there, and has said the things about Ilhan Omar, for instance, that he has.
They'll be aware of the Muslim ban, right?
So they'd be. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm sure there's public survey data about this. I'd say, so there are a number of reactions to something like the Muslim ban. So, right, there would be the idea that Muslims are de facto suspicious and should not be allowed into the country. And that would be that first category of those who are attracted to Trump's rhetoric. Then there would be, obviously those who did not hear about it. But then there would be those who are receiving news from outlets that are especially emphasizing, for instance, the fact that, well, he didn't ban from every Muslim country. Yes, the countries he banned from were majority Muslim, but if he was really doing a Muslim ban, he would have banned, there are other countries he could have added to the list. So maybe faith wasn't the defining, characteristic. Maybe there was a homeland security interest at stake. So it maybe wasn't really singling out Muslims for this. And there are a whole range of ideas and rationalizations and just ways of looking at things that mean that, in other words, I don't want to say, because I don't think it would be true, that sort of all of Trump's voters approve of the Muslim ban, or the Muslim ban as I think we conceive it to be. But it certainly plays a role. I would another thing I'd add to this is, what was, I think I mentioned in my overview, Trump actually gained among Muslim voters in this election, but estimates are about 4 points, and it's his rhetoric around this issue has been very similar to his rhetoric around immigration. And if you watch the Republican convention, they were actually put in a great deal of effort to suggest that everything Democrats had been saying about Trump's views on Muslims or immigrants or other categories of folks, sort of political constituencies, that's all Democratic hand-wringing. And so they would have segments during the Republican convention of Trump welcoming Muslim immigrants to the country. They actually had a Muslim clergy give an invocation during the convention, and so a great deal of resources was put into in 2020 to sort of suggest to Americans that what they'd been hearing for the last 4 years about how Trump approached these communities really wasn't the real story, and that expenditure had a marginal but an identifiable impact on the election results.
Thank you. A link to that. Afifa, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think it is basically directly linked to that, which is that you mentioned that Trump gained support amongst Muslims and also Hispanic evangelicals. And I was wondering whether we have data on what motivated that support, that increased support.
We don't, not yet. I know that just in recent days, CARE released a survey that they conducted on Muslim vote, and so I could direct you there. I think generally I'd say. So there are a few theories. One would be what I just named, which is that, with the passing of 4 years, and with sort of in 2016, there were great, the reality rarely reaches the level of fear of what could come. And so I think for, again, a marginal number of Muslim voters, their response was, Trump hasn't been nearly as bad as I was told that he would be in 2016, even with, the Muslim ban and policies that we've mentioned. I think the other piece would be the expenditures that the Trump campaign, put in. And then there is, there is a narrative around sort of Trump's isolationist foreign policy that Muslim scholars and election onlookers have suggested is motivating for Muslim support of Trump. The fact that rhetorically he advanced the idea that we should stop getting involved in foreign conflicts and that kind of thing. And so someone like Dalia Mogahed at Gallup would advance that as a substantive reason for, again, his, only about a third of American Muslims supported Trump, but a third is significant. CARE estimates that for the first time, over 1 million American Muslims voted in the election. And so, we're talking about over 300,000 votes for Donald Trump if CARE's estimates are accurate.
Well, we are running out of time, to be honest. We've probably gone over, but I'm going to try and wrap up the last 2 or 3 questions together if I can, and whatever you can answer, that would be great. So, from YouTube, do you agree that declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel was playing to certain Christian votes? Did Trump do anything else to please these voters and retain their support? Is that linked to that?
Yes.
Sorry? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, absolutely, and quite explicitly. I mean, when you have Secretary of State Pompeo speaking from Jerusalem during the Republican convention, which by itself was unprecedented, yes, there's a political appeal there. Now, I wouldn't say that the entire move was that there wasn't some kind of foreign policy justification for it, even if I might disagree with it. But certainly when it came to election time, that was one of the leading sort of things that they would bring as a success to various religious communities. So yes, I'd agree with that.
Do you believe that? Sorry, I'm rushing a bit. Do you believe that the Christian evangelical leadership has failed in tackling the issue of Islamophobia because they care about these other 4 main issues that you mentioned?
Again, this in some ways requires a longer conversation. One of, as I think I stated earlier, one of the defining characteristics of evangelicalism is how diffuse it is. And so even when you have its leading evangelical institutions taking on Islamophobia, which has happened when you talk about the National Association of Evangelicals, when you talk about even the Southern Baptist Convention, what happens is what you really need to see are sort of grass tops leaders and leaders who are in communities identifying this as a personal issue and taking responsibility on a local level. And I do think we could see more of that. I will say, we have seen that in many local communities where evangelicals and Muslims live alongside one another. One of the problems is because of the sort of geographic concentrations of American evangelicals and of American Muslims, is that there's something that theologian Howard Thurman calls contact without fellowship. And so this idea that people have ideas of what the other religious community is, but they're never actually encountering each other in any meaningful way. And so we need to think very carefully from a political level, from a civic level, about how you build that kind of not just sort of contact, but encounter of fellowship that is going to be essential in 21st century America for both evangelical and Muslim communities.
And the final question, Francis.
Hello, Francis.
Good evening, and it's good to be here, and all honor and respect to the organizers. What a wonderful event. We have a tradition in the UK, amongst many other traditions, which is that some of our evangelicals, many of our evangelicals, lean well to the left. In fact, are significantly radical. And I'm just wondering how that tradition survives in the US. Is it still alive? And where would people seeking to build justice go looking for them if they wanted to encourage them?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that question. You know, the history of evangelicalism in America has just worked out very differently than it has, not just in the UK, but in much of Europe. There's actually a really brilliant piece on comparing the evolution of evangelicalism in America with Swedish evangelicals in this publication called Breaking Ground. I don't have the article in front of me, but would encourage people to read this really incredible article. There is a progressive evangelical tradition in the States. It has been part of what's fueled significant movements for social reform in this country, particularly when you look at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. A few things have happened. One, there's a lot of that energy is in mainline Protestantism. And so sort of politically speaking, will be identified in mainline Protestantism. The other would be, it's just less institutionally developed. And so there are organizations like Evangelicals for Climate Change or Sojourners. But compared to right-wing evangelicalism, there's just much less money, much less infrastructure, which leads to, I think, a misrepresentation, or at least in sort of when you talk about national politics, progressive evangelicals not having as much influence as maybe they could. I do think that there's a future for, if not a progressive evangelicalism, certainly an evangelicalism that isn't bound by the culture wars of the last 4 decades of American politics. I do think a lot of the oxygen and a lot of the energy of those debates is becoming exhausted, at least for a certain swath of American evangelicals. What is really going to be needed is institution building and strengthening of old institutions, but really new institutions are going to be needed to create a viable vehicle for evangelicals who are maintaining their religious commitments, but do not feel compelled by the political commitments of the last, again, 40 years of evangelical politics.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm sorry we do have to cut it there. There have been a couple more questions, but it's been a real pleasure to have you and to really quiz you on all these different areas. And thank you so much for coming, for sharing your views. It's really been an honor for us to have you here, and we look forward to great things from you.
Hey, thank you very much. Grateful for you, and pray for the peace and security and the prospering of you and your congregation and those my friends on the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick announcements. Firstly, just very briefly, next week we have Dr. Ursula Batiste, who's talking about looking over the early Muhaddith's shoulder, a study of hadith production and transmission based on early sources. The week after, we also have another US election-related speaker, Brenda Abadal, who's going to speak about the US elections, what the results mean for Muslim communities in particular. She was a congressional candidate for the Biden administration and led many elements of the Arab Americans for Biden. And the week after, we have Women and Gender in the Quran by Dr. Celine Ibrahim, who's written a book which is just coming out at this moment in time. Actually, I think it's just come out. And the final one, the final thing just now, sorry, just one more thing. So, yes, it's up. It is up. Great. Today I'm very, very happy, pleased, and really excited to say that with the grace of Almighty Allah, it gives us all at SICM a great pleasure to announce the engagement of Muhammad, son of Mansour and Mukhtar Manji, to Nisa, daughter of Fatima and Mahdi Anami, at Mahfil SICM. We congratulate both the families. It's really a pleasure to hear Muhammad has got engaged. He was someone who has always been one of the youngest members of all of us, and it's, you know, he's always been there. He's always been part of the community, and we really look forward to seeing how Nisa can join us all and turn Muhammad into a man. So thank you all very much, and congratulations to you both. Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael.